Despite the fact that it was rush hour and there were crowds of people on the street, involuntarily crossing paths with each other, everyone tried to stay away from this man. He seemed to bear the imprint of trouble on his face in the form of a crimson scar, which was poorly hidden behind thick bristles. A baseball cap pulled over his eyes protected the man from the curious looks of ill-wishers and ordinary bystanders. In all other respects, the man's appearance wasn't great. Shabby jeans, an old windbreaker of indeterminate color, and heavy, worn shoes. For people on the street, the man was just another homeless man, one of the many in their city. But the man himself didn't think of himself as a beggar and tried to always keep himself and his clothes clean. Having to stay in contact with all sorts of vagabonds and dark personalities, he always radiated confidence and never shied away from danger. In the homeless community, Richard was considered a tough and direct person, which was why no one wanted to get in his way. Unlike his brothers in misfortune, the man didn't smoke and rarely drank alcohol. Those who knew Richard well knew that there were many dark spots in his biography that they usually chose to avoid talking about. Richard had gray hair at the temples, which was why no one could determine his age. He could have been 40 or 45, or maybe even 50. Richard himself never spoke about it, but the most astute of the people around him felt that he'd been in prison. However, he didn't look like an outright criminal and could speak intelligently without using any slang words if he wanted to. Being a loner, Richard didn't join any of the street communities and earned his own money for food. Collecting recyclables such as glass, paper, and scrap metal, he took them to collection points and thus had enough money not to die of hunger. And now, walking down the street, the man was looking for something that could help him earn $1 or $2. Richard never mugged anyone, therefore he wasn't interested in the wallets or bags of ordinary citizens. The man walked about a quarter of a mile, after which he witnessed something strange. A boy of about 10 was riding by the road on a brand new bicycle with gleaming chrome wheels and handlebars. The boy drove out onto the roadway from time to time, rode there for a bit, and returned to the sidewalk. Everything would have been fine, but at that very moment, a huge truck appeared from around the corner, which the little boy, of course, didn't see. The homeless man realized that a terrible accident could happen any second, so he ran up to the boy and pulled his bicycle off the road. At that very moment, the truck passed by with a loud sound, dousing Richard's face with the heat of its engine. The driver waved his hand at the boy angrily and drove on. Richard breathed a sigh of relief and looked at the boy before asking, "Are you trying to kill yourself? Why aren't you paying attention to the road? You have to be more careful." The little boy felt very embarrassed and lowered his eyes. It was clear that he was ashamed of what had happened and wanted to forget about this incident as soon as possible. "Thank you, sir. I'm sorry for being careless. I'm so very grateful for your help. Also, I think you deserve a reward for saving me," the boy said, having come to his senses. "A reward? Really? Well, that's interesting." Richard smiled. Of course, he didn't really believe that saving the boy's life would get him even a couple of cents. "My father owns a restaurant. You know the one in the big building on Main Street? He has a lot of money. I'm sure he'd like to thank you. If you'd like, we could go to see my father right now," the boy added. At the word restaurant, Richard's eyes began to sparkle. Maybe it was a sign of interest, or maybe he was simply very hungry. Whatever it was, Richard accepted the boy's offer and quickened his pace to keep up with him. On the way to the restaurant, they started talking, and the homeless man found out that the boy's name was Kevin. His father, Floyd Brown, was a businessman and spent all of his free time at work. "It makes sense. Running a restaurant takes a lot of time." Richard grunted and got an annoyed look in his eyes. "Yes, you're right, sir. But because my father is always at work, my mom is often sad and cries a lot," the boy said. Richard now realized why the boy was virtually left to his own devices. The relationship between his parents was clearly strained, and the homeless man understood how hard it must have been for the boy. The homeless man could see the outlines of the restaurant in the distance and started feeling nervous. The man felt like a schoolboy before the most important exam in his life. The doorman gave Richard a contemptuous look, and if it weren't for Kevin, who was walking beside him, he wouldn't have let this homeless man into the establishment. "Hello, Howard, is Dad here?" the boy asked, as if nothing strange was happening. "No, Mr. Brown left on business, but if you really need to, you can talk to the administrator," the doorman replied. "No, I should probably just call him," Kevin answered and took his brand new smartphone out of his pocket. All this time, Richard stood by and didn't utter a single word. The homeless man just looked at the restaurant, which brought back many memories. It all happened in the distant past when Richard wasn't homeless yet and was living a completely different life. Kevin's voice pulled the man out of his sad trip down memory lane. He already talked to his father and briefly explained what had happened. "Richard, my dad would like to offer you a job at his restaurant as a reward for saving my life." "What do you say about that?" the boy asked cautiously. Kevin had already recovered from the initial shock caused by the incident on the road and was now talking calmly and rather confident. "What kind of job is it?" Richard asked. The little boy hesitated for a moment, but then he said, "Dad can afford you the position of a janitor. You'd have to take care of the back rooms and the territory adjacent to the restaurant." A web of deep wrinkles spread on Richard's forehead. On the one hand, the man needed money real bad, but on the other hand, the position of a janitor clearly wasn't his dream job and felt even somewhat humiliating. Since Kevin was waiting for an answer, there was no time to think it through. "Well, a janitor it is then. I'll take it," Richard replied. A sweet smile immediately appeared on Kevin's face. It was clear that the boy was incredibly happy that Richard agreed to work for his father. Kevin didn't even know that at this very time, Floyd Brown wasn't thinking about his son or work at all. The owner of the restaurant was closely watching the hands of the croupier dealing poker cards. Floyd was always a gambler. Even in his life, he often took unnecessary risks when they could have easily been avoided. No one really knew where he got the money to open a restaurant and pay for his huge mansion and his car. Floyd Brown was a dark horse, and his past was covered in a thick veil of mystery. Those who dared to look behind it were guaranteed to get problems, both for themselves and for their families. Floyd loved living the rich life, full of expensive cars and beautiful women. Despite the fact that the businessman's wife was one of the most beautiful women in the city, he still couldn't help himself and often had flings on the side. Richard took his first day at the job very responsibly and prepared for it with due diligence. Trying not to get in the management's way, the man cleaned the utility rooms and everything that was within the scope of his job's description. Richard worked silently, trying to stay away from the rest of the restaurant's staff. However, he always exchanged a couple of words with Kevin whenever he came across the boy. Richard never saw himself as the sentimental kind. Thus, he even couldn't understand why he grew attached to Kevin. The man saw that the boy didn't get enough affection and attention from his father, which was probably the reason why he was so drawn to Richard. 2 weeks flew by. During this time, Richard never once saw the owner of the restaurant, who had probably forgotten about the man's existence by that time. Floyd believed that all he had to do was organize the work process and that he didn't need to spend his days at the stuffy office. Nevertheless, Floyd wanted to stay in control of everything his employees did, so the businessman installed surveillance cameras in the restaurant. Richard didn't know about it since the equipment was installed a couple of days before he started on the job. Moreover, it wasn't like anyone was actually interested in what he was doing. He always had a cap pulled over his eyes and was always dressed modestly. Who would pay any attention to him? One day, as Richard was sweeping the steps at the entrance, he saw an expensive car stop in front of the restaurant. The doorman, Howard, who was standing nearby, immediately whispered, "Emily Brown, she's the owner's wife. Good woman. She always leaves great tips. So come on, get more energetic with your broom, and she might give you $1 or $2. Having heard the woman's name, Richard froze. His face turned pale and his hands started shaking. The doorman gave the janitor a contemptuous look and hurried off into the restaurant lobby. Meanwhile, the owner's wife almost caught up with Richard and was about to pass him by when the man touched her on the shoulder. "Hello, Emily," the janitor whispered softly. The woman turned around in surprise and saw a man in a janitor's uniform standing in front of her. Looking into the janitor's eyes, Emily shuddered and turned pale as chalk. "Richard? Is that really you? How is this possible? They told me that you died," the woman said, having a hard time holding back her tears. "Yes, it's me. Sorry for the way I look, but 10 years in the state county jail would change anyone," Richard answered sadly. The encounter looked very strange. A rich, well-dressed woman talking to a janitor, clutching a broom in his hands. They stood there a little longer, after which they hugged and started kissing, completely disregarding everyone around them. Emily was the first one to get a grip. "No, Richard, not now. They might see us and you'll get in trouble. You have to be careful because Kevin is your son." Richard shuddered and looked straight into Emily's eyes. He knew his wife better than anyone else and understood that she was telling the truth. Richard's eyes filled with tears, even though the man hadn't cried in 10 years. "Let's talk somewhere more private, okay? I'll find you," Emily whispered and kissed Richard goodbye before disappearing into the lobby of the restaurant. Richard stood on the steps in front of the entrance for a long time, digesting the information he just got. He had no way of knowing that the entire encounter had been filmed by the surveillance camera hanging at the entrance to the restaurant. In any case, Richard didn't abandon his duties and continued to work the broom as if nothing had happened. These days, no one would recognize him as Richard Gray, who was actually a successful businessman just some 10 years ago. Everything changed in an instant when Floyd Brown set his eyes on his partner's property. Despite the fact that the restaurant was opened with Richard's money, his partner considered it his own. Having framed the true owner of the restaurant, Floyd did everything to ensure that he was convicted and sentenced to time in prison. At that time, Richard's wife, Emily, was in her first month of pregnancy. In order for his partner to never get out of prison, Floyd paid some people a large amount of money to make him disappear. It was only by a lucky chance that Richard managed to survive and make some important friends who could protect him inside the prison. Meanwhile, Floyd told Emily that her husband had died, even though he actually survived the attack. For the longest time, the pregnant woman refused to believe that Richard was dead, but the devious businessman knew how to be convincing and persistent. Then, Floyd persuaded the distraught widow to marry him. As a kind of reward, he gave his newborn son his last name and agreed to raise him as his own. During these 10 years, Floyd got so used to the fact that Richard would never get out of prison that he didn't even notice how quickly time had flown by. But the most interesting part was that the devious businessman didn't even suspect that 2 weeks ago he hired Richard to work at the restaurant. And even now, watching the surveillance video, Floyd didn't recognize his ex-partner. The only thing that angered the businessman was the scene at the restaurant, where his wife hugged and kissed the janitor. "Oh no, you didn't. I'll teach you to hug other people's wives." Floyd gritted his teeth. Having arrived at the restaurant, he told the assistant to get the janitor into his office. Even when he saw Richard up close, Floyd didn't even realize who he really was. And only when the cleaner started speaking did the businessman remember everything. His face turned red and he started sweating profusely. "They assured me that you were dead. I paid a lot of money for it," Richard whispered, stepping back. "Yes, you did, and I should have died, but I didn't, and now I came for you," Richard said. Floyd's hands were shaking like crazy, and sweat was pouring down his face. At that moment, the businessman seemed to have some kind of a nervous breakdown and started talking about everything that came to his mind. Floyd didn't know that all this time, his former partner had a miniature voice recorder on him, which recorded his confession from beginning to end. What the businessman said would be enough to send him to jail for 20 years. By the time Floyd realized his mistake, it was already too late. Soon, the police burst into the office. Richard called them in advance. It was the right decision because the officers prevented Floyd from using his weapon. Now, Floyd was awaiting trial and would surely get sentenced to a term in the same prison where the real owner of the restaurant had to do time after Floyd had framed him. Richard cleaned himself up and took charge of the business. The former homeless man didn't hold a grudge against Emily for one simple reason. He never stopped loving his wife. However, the person who was the happiest about how things turned out was Kevin, who unwittingly brought his biological dad to his own restaurant. Now that the family was reunited, they could give each other everything they couldn't even dream of before. It's hard to say what would have happened to the people of this story if Richard hadn't saved the boy, who actually turned out to be his own son. All we can do is trust that everything in this world happens for a reason, and that the Creator has a clear plan for each and every one of us.